So just as a brief summary of which space we're in the design school, this is the Regenerative Finance Lab. I think this is the secret little corner that most of our members still haven't discovered yet, where a lot of people who are asking, how do you do this in practice? Are there real world examples? What are the case studies? And every 2 weeks, we are just like rolling in deeper into the actual practice of bioregional scale regeneration, funding and governance, the design of collaborative frameworks and all kinds of things under this name, regenerative finance. And one of the big surprises for a lot of people who come here is that they'll say something to the order of, well, I don't really feel very comfortable working with money and finance. That's why I didn't come here. And then they realize they should have been here the whole time because we're talking about how to flow value into a human ecosystem. So it's all about things that all of us care about and that everyone here has some expertise that is relevant. Today, I'm going to be sharing with you the work of one of my colleagues. This is, I think, the 4th time in the Finance Lab that I have either presented on behalf of Natalia Ortiz or she has come here and presented herself. But I'm going to show you the budget she created. And before I show you the budget that she created, I want to basically give a little bit of context. So in Barichara, we're about 6 years in to creating a framework for regeneration at the bioregional scale, creating a regenerative economy in a holistic way, restoring entire watersheds, the whole works. We're like doing all of it. And one of the key things that we've done in the process of getting to here is we identified a model of organizational structure that serves us very well, which is the model of a community foundation adapted to the territorial scale. So I just want to briefly name what a community foundation is. A community foundation is a neutral actor with respect to other actors in the community who is able to mobilize resources into the community in a way that does not introduce competition between the local actors. So, the Territorial Foundation could come in and instigate a program of regenerative education for children and would immediately be competing with all of the alternative schools. And so in that sense, the Territorial Foundation is organized at the territorial scale in a way that supports the holistic well-being of the territory as a whole, in a way that increases synergies and cooperation and reduces competition.
Yeah.
And so that's what the Territorial Foundation is in its sort of most general, simple introduction. We have a foundation called Barichara Regenerativa, and we received some funding that we need to allocate. So my partner in crime, Natalia, has spent the last 6 months after the previous 18 months doing a specific kind of work, which is she is doing bioregional weaving by going out and looking at what all the different key leaders and key regenerative processes are doing, building trust-based relationships with them, identifying their strengths and what they bring to the territory, their gaps and inadequacies and the things that they need. And then she has been tasked with creating a budget to allocate scarce resources, where we don't have enough money to fund everything, but we've had, as you'll see today, about $225,000 has come into our account. And we want to spend all of that money in the next year. And so in the last 6 months, she has been continually updating with people. What are you doing over here in this local network of multi-stakeholder action? What are you doing in this partnership with the local mayor's office for territorial planning? What are you doing over here with this reforestation project? And gathering together that intelligence and building all the trust to be able to create a framework to distribute funds into an entire ecosystem. And what I'm going to show you today is the outcome of that work. I'm very pleased that I can officially say the budget I'm going to share with you was approved by all of the members of our Territorial Foundation 2 days ago. I'm on the executive committee, or what we'd call in Spanish, the Junta Directiva for the Territorial Foundation, and I'm one of its co-founders. So I got to approve this budget within that executive committee and then participate in approving it again with all of the members of our foundation on Wednesday, which means we can now start dispersing the money with this plan. And what you're going to see is this budget is a strategic way of coordinating for building capacity with deep awareness of systemic collapse and trying to build capacities as though money may never come to us again. And so we're operating in a very realistic way, a very grounded way, and we have a set of resources that we need to invest in the most strategic ways we can. And the budget I'm going to show you is what I would say is Natalia's best thinking, and she's a very bright woman. It's Natalia's best thinking about how to allocate these funds with participation and input from a very diverse set of participants. So by the end of the presentation today, you're going to be able to see how this bioregional thinking and this organizing framework can lead into concrete actions. And I see Sanjay has his hand up. So Sanjay, is there something you wanted to bring in before?
Yeah, very quick. I was just thinking before you dive into the financial stuff, as an organizational organizing principle, is community foundation the way to go about setting the entity, right? In terms of bioregioning?
I would say yes, if it's a true community foundation.
Okay.
There are community foundations all over the world. There are hundreds and hundreds of them, probably in 70 or 80 countries. And most of them are basically rich people who pay a small staff to do research for them, for the rich people to decide where to give money directly. I'll just give you an example. The Toronto Foundation, which spends about 30 million Canadian dollars per year, about 29 million of that is donor advised funds where the donors just decide where they want to give the money. So only about 3 or 4% of it is actually allocated by the foundation. In our case, we're a true community foundation in the sense that 100% of our funding is allocated, or rather, I would say this is our goal. And you'll see there's some midway step right now. Our goal is for there to be territorial governance that allocates funding in a strategic and adaptive manner. And we're setting that up. But we have to set it up with the specific intelligence and perspective of our leadership, someone like Natalia, who goes out and gathers specific kinds of information, is better positioned to know how to allocate funding, but she's not the rich person making the donation. And so I would say community foundation models, when they're properly structured, are very well suited for this kind of work. But most of them, and the staff of those foundations would tell you, they are frustrated that most of the decisions are still rich people in their communities deciding what to do with the money. And so,
so the reason I ask is because there are new models like using the perpetual purpose trust. Is that sorry, I don't want to hijack the meeting, but I just wanted to ask this because this is important in terms of then the flows happening, right? How you set up the organization.
Yeah, I would just say that what's more important than having the perfect model is having a scalable model in its relationship to neighbors. Because like one thing we're doing in Barichara is we're part of the movement of territorial foundations in Colombia. So we're part of a network of 10 territories. And we're creating shared frameworks that include organizational, legal, accounting, and so on, so that we can move funds and collaborate across scales very easily. So I think it's more important to have that adaptive multi-scale capacity rather than to say, this is the one model that's the right model. Because yet I think that we should be fearful of anyone who claims they have the right model, right? Because the model is not the territory. But there are models that are better adapted to being part of the territory. Stephen, is there something you want to add in?
Yeah, hi, just on the same point. I'm just curious if you could speak or if you have like sessions on this. I'm curious like how it's a question of disconnecting the money for the control from who's giving the money, right? Is that basically it? And then also generating local value that's coming from the bottom up. It's probably those two pieces. Is there 'cause I'm new to this group and I love it. And I'm curious, like, is there some stuff in the school that you could point to that where it talks about that or any resources where I could learn more about how that works?
Yes, definitely. There are a lot of recordings from previous finance labs, and there'd be some that are specifically about collaborative budgets and other things that are really directly related. And you'll see it in the budget today. You'll see that we're moving in that direction. So I'll explain some of that. So great setup. Those are really good questions. So let's go ahead and jump into the presentation part so that you can see how this budget works. We'll have plenty of time for discussion afterwards. thinking it'll probably take about 20 or 25 minutes to go through the presentation, and we've got an hour and 15 minutes. So we got a lot of time. So let's jump right into the presentation. Here we go. I always have to minimize a few windows. And here we go. So I titled the session today, Investing in a Bioregional Regeneration Ecosystem, because I want to emphasize three things. That there is a way of investing different kinds of capital, not just financial capital, many kinds of capital. There are ways of bringing resources into the second part, which is bioregional frameworks, or holistic place-based frameworks, and then to invest in entire ecosystems of relationships rather than individual projects, so that you can start to see how all of this works together in practice. So first thing I want to emphasize is that what I'm going to tell you is that a budget is a story or a set of stories. And so we're going to tell a story about how we're investing resources. And what you're going to see is, just like the dandelion, our story is a way of gathering together or pooling some resources and then letting them disperse into the landscape in a way that where they land, the soils are prepared to receive them, and that they can grow and build their own capacities in a decentralized manner across the territory. So you're going to really see that in the way this budget is structured. And the other thing I want to emphasize here is that we're taking a regenerative framework, which means this is a living systems model. And so just like preparing the soil that you plant in so that the roots can grow deep and so that the mycelium can be there, so that the water can absorb, you really need to think in an ecological way about how you prepare the places where resources land. And so we're going to talk very concretely. We have about $225,000 that have come into our territorial foundation for this year. We have a whole diversity of regenerative processes that are unfolding. I'm not going to go into depth of what those processes are, but you'll see a few of them specifically named in our budget. And we want to distribute those resources into where we either already have prepared soil, or the resources are preparing the soil for what comes later. So the question is, how can we invest these resources and capacities that go far beyond what we have today? So we might build soils and plant a mango tree, but we're going to harvest mangoes later. We want to be thinking in that holistic, temporal, and place-based way simultaneously. One of the big things for us is that we got the great news that there's a foundation that wants to fund us for 2 years. So we have funding this year, and we'll get funding next year. So we have funding from from June until May of 2025-26, which is the budget we're talking about today. But then in May of next year, in 2026, another round of funding is coming to us, assuming that the global philanthropy infrastructure doesn't collapse during that time. And so we decided to operate on the assumption that the future is not going to be like the past, which is, we're not just going to assume that we'll keep getting funding from the outside. Instead, we're going to plan as though we have 2 years of funding and try and invest in the capacity to never need funding again from the outside, or more realistically, if for some reason funding from the outside goes away, can we still maintain core functions? Can we keep going in a self-sustaining way locally with less resources from the outside? Now, 2 years is a really fast turnaround. So it's not realistic to think that we're 100% sustainable in 2 years. But what is realistic is to think that 2 years from now, we'll have much more local capacity to do things in the absence of outside support, and that we can lean on that to move forward in some modified way. So that's a core part of the thinking of the budget that I'm about to show you. So here's the basic structure of our budget in a very general conceptual way. 25% of the budget is going to go to general operations, and I'll explain what we mean by that in a moment. And then the remainder of the funding is going to go to 6 different community funds, which is different thematic areas that are organized around their own multi-stakeholder groups to achieve different goals, all within a holistic framework of territorial or bioregional regeneration. And that all of these resources are moving into an ongoing and already existing flow of regenerative processes. There's a lot of work happening in our community already, and we're bringing these resources in to leverage what we have to move it all forward in a coherent way. And what we want to do with these resources at a high level is we want to increase our capacities for territorial governance. And we want to do it in different ways. So as you look at how we're allocating the funding and the way it's structured, think about how we're building autonomy and sovereignty, self-governance, participatory leadership, community learning, communications, other things that we need to have happen for governance to operate and work at the territorial scale. And that's a big focus of how this whole budget has been organized. The other thing I want to emphasize is that when I talk about this budget, this $225,000, that I literally mean this is the money that arrives in the bank account of our foundation and that our bank account then disperses through contracts into our local community. The reason I say this is that more than twice that amount of money is coming into regenerative projects, but it is not in the bank account of the foundation Barichara Regenerativa. So I want you to see how an organization, a bioregionally focused regenerative organization, can allocate the resources it has to complement and have synergies with other resources in the community. So this $225,000 is not all the money we have in our territory. It's only the money we have in this specific organization that is organized in a bioregional way. So what do we mean when we say that we want to have support staff for general operations? This is 25% of the total budget, or about $50,000 of the total, slightly more than $50,000 of the total. What is this general operations budget doing? First of all, we have a legal requirement that the general operations budget cannot be more than 30% for the way that our legal mandate of nonprofit status works in Colombia. So we wanted to stay below that level, but then do a whole bunch of things with, this is what you would call your landscape partnership in the model of Common Land Foundation. This is what you would call your landscape team in the language of Bioregional Weaving Labs. This is your bioregional organizing team in the language of BioFi Project. This is it right here. What are these people doing? Well, they're core to holding the structure for diverse things to happen in our territory. So this is a core staff paid by the foundation to do general coordination of the territorial foundation's work. So this is doing tracking of contracting and budgets and assessing and other things that are absolutely core to maintaining the coherence of our territorial work. So they're doing things like administering of financial flows and reporting on those financial flows, which includes transparency and accountability, not just to our donors, but to the community itself. We need to have a way of revealing our budget so that our local community knows who makes decision about money and where it goes. They're doing a lot of design and build of monitoring and evaluation systems to say, how do we structure our spreadsheets so that you can monitor and track how we define different objectives, how we measure our progress toward those objectives, how we evaluate how well we're doing. And by the way, all of this money is discretionary money, which means we don't even need to report to our donor. This is all reporting to our community. And you're going to see how this general operations team is building an administration, monitoring, and evaluation system that supports community governance, because the rest of the budget is building that community governance. So there's a big focus on monitoring and evaluation systems for our territorial foundation. And because we're part of a network of territorial foundations, we have a higher scale in the Northern Andes Regeneration Fund, that these administering, reporting, monitoring, and evaluation systems are actually going to be replicated in 9 other territories in Colombia, learning from what we're doing in Barichara through that Northern Andes Fund. So it's really important that we invest part of our resources in very good operational budgeting, monitoring, and evaluations. And this includes a small budget, because of the way that Colombia's legal frameworks work, for us to have an external and an independent financial assessor to be able to have legal staff basically available to us so that we can ask them to help us with the way that we do our reporting to the tax agency of Colombia, which is called DION, which is the equivalent of the US's version of the IRS. And so that we can be sure that everything is done in really powerful, robust ways to protect our foundation, to protect our funders, and to protect our community members. All of this you could think of as like back office support for informal community projects. Then also we need to have a little bit of money set aside for tax payments and organizational maintenance and the way that the organizational frameworks of Colombia work. So there's a small amount of money there. And you can see by looking at all of that, that we have the capacity to then go in and do other things. So our first of 6 community funds that general operating staff is helping to coordinate is to strengthen the regenerative ecosystem of Barichara. Now, this one's a little bit smaller. It's 15% of the total budget, and its focus is on capacity building in a couple of really interesting ways. One of those is that there is a thing that we call ciclos vivos in Spanish, which is living cycles. Living cycles are the convening of multi-stakeholder networks within a thematic area. I'll describe one. In the last year, we had a team of facilitators, of bioregional weavers, who facilitated the gathering of 29 different local regenerative projects that are associated with the restoration of watersheds in 3 different watersheds of our territory. And they created this group called Voces de Agua, or Voices of Water, that represent the watershed restoration work of our territory. And this is a living cycle, a cycle that is meeting multiple times a year through convening, through strategic planning, through creating of smaller work groups using a sociocratic process. So in a way, you could think of this as the gathering of intelligence from the people doing the work on the ground. So part of our funding is going to these living cycles, which is the multi-stakeholder groups can set up participatory decision-making and budgeting with some of the money that comes in through our territorial foundation. And part of that funding is to pay a group of community weavers, which is participatory facilitation of multiple convenings to map and identify and to coordinate different work groups to create participatory governance. This is how we're creating governance of watersheds. So some of the actors in this living cycle are community aqueducts. Some of them are alternative education processes that work with rural schools. Some of them are people that work with the mayor's office in the public sector. Some of them are local networks of farmers who created a cooperative to do agroforestry. And so the idea is that these living cycles are a weaving of multi-stakeholder networks where our foundation invests in the facilitators who hold the process and the communication, the monitoring, and the reporting of that work. But in addition to that, we're taking part of our budget to provide training and virtual facilitation. Specifically, we have people in our community, and some of them are members of our foundation, who are experts in using Miro boards, which is a way of basically doing a virtual facilitation of collaborative learning to create shared frameworks of governance and decision-making using decentralized virtual methods. So we're going to invest some money in training people in our community to do virtual facilitation so that we have more people that can facilitate this weaving process. Then we're also going to be training members of our community who are associated with these living cycles in participatory governance. Specifically this year, we're going to pay for trainings in the art of hosting. The art of hosting, which is related to sociocracy and related to other forms of participatory governance, is going to help us to train more people in facilitation. So we have more community leaders that can do virtual facilitation and that can do participatory governance. And this is going to strengthen these living cycles and provide us with more community weavers who have been trained to do this with a shared language and a shared set of techniques. And then we're also going to set aside a small budget because one of our challenges in the past is we have all these amazing community leaders, and there might be an opportunity for them to go and learn or share what we're learning in a larger network of actions in Colombia, or in some larger network in Latin America, or globally, like with the Presencing Institute and Theory U and various other kinds of groups. So we're setting aside a small budget to be able to send members of our community to learn and teach in other partner networks. Now, when you look, this is the first of 6 community funds. 15% of our budget And notice how all of this builds toward a patterning of territorial governance. Community weavers that are supporting multi-stakeholder networks to create shared frameworks of action, to then give money to them in small work groups, to practice allocating funding through participatory budgeting, but also training more people in our community to lead and facilitate these processes themselves. All of this is strengthening the regenerative ecosystem of Barichara. We're focusing mostly right now in two transversal themes, which is water, which affects everything in our territory, and regenerative education, which affects everything in our territory. But the idea is for us to do this across all thematic areas of our territory in the future. So this is one of 6 community funds, 15% of the budget, supporting these community weaving processes and this leadership cultivation or capacity building in our community. Now we go on to community fund number 2, which is the actual restoration of water and natural ecosystems. Now here you might be surprised to see that our budget is really small. It's only 6% of the total budget. Why is that? That is because when we started this work 5 years ago, we started by me raising money, bringing it into the territory, and then funding regenerative projects on the ground. So we funded reforestation work in Bioparque Moncora. We funded the creation of the nature reserve Ori Hindalagua and funding the restoration work that's happening there. And we funded other on-the-ground actions. But what we found was some of those projects have started to create their own financing mechanisms, so they're no longer dependent on us. Others are too dependent on us, and we need to make them less dependent on us by giving them less money through the Barichara Territorial Foundation, but instead fund these community weaving processes to strengthen how we can mobilize resources to them. And what that means in practical terms is we're investing in capacity building more than investing in planting trees, so that we can have more capacity building for planting trees in the future. And so there's a really powerful thing that happens in Colombia. It's called EOT. It's basically a territorial plan. It's a mechanism of the federal government of Colombia where every department, which is the equivalent of a state or province, brings forth a territorial plan. They're usually done on 25-year timeframes, and they determine how the federal government can bring money into the local landscape. In Barichara, the last time we had a territorial plan that was created or approved was in 2003, 22 years ago, which means there's no federal money from the Colombian government that comes to Barichara. None, zero. We get no money for infrastructure, for like water filtration, nothing for reforestation, nothing for public health, nothing for education outside of the normal public schools, because we don't have a territorial plan. It turns out that we have this group called Voces de Agua, Voices of Water, and they have a thing called the table, which is they call it meseta in Spanish, but the table is an advisory council of 5 work groups that have been working with the mayor's office throughout the last 2 years, and they are as regenerative as they come. This is a group of people who want to restore all of our watersheds, restore our forests, change our food system to regenerative, all kinds of things, and they have no mechanism for receiving funding right now. So what we're going to do is hijack this territorial planning process. We're going to invest money in the Voces de Agua group for them to build a strategic plan of territorial development to bring to this territorial planning process of the federal government to secure funding between now and 2050 for the territory through existing mechanisms that are not being taken advantage of. So basically, we're investing in the capacity to mobilize Colombia's resources to Barichara by investing in Voces de Agua, or Voices of Water, to be able to implement, or basically to create a territorial plan and submit it for approval, which means we would be the first territory in Colombia's history to have a regenerative territorial plan. And the reason this is possible is that we don't currently have one. And we have this organized framework of multi-stakeholder groups. So we're going to give funding to them to build a territorial plan in August, to be submitted in September and October, to transform territorial planning for the next few decades. And while we're doing that, we're going to give a little bit of money to 2 actual ecosystem restoration projects. Bioparque Moncor is a community forest, and Syntropic Agriculture is a network of learning exchanges around agroforestry systems. We're going to give small amounts of money to each of them. And then we're going to set aside some seed funds for emergent projects using that ciclo vivo, that living cycle, to allocate funding to these projects in a collaborative way. So basically, we're going to support the creation of food forests and agroforestry systems, reforestation, soil building, watershed restoration through 3 different mechanisms. Through supporting the creation of a territorial plan to gain access to federal funding, through the funding of 2 specific projects that only continue to be supported by previous money we've brought them. We're going to keep them going as we transition how we support them. And then we're going to provide a pool of seed funding to go into a facilitated process to create what's basically a shared budget, where several groups together will decide how to allocate funding. Some of that funding could go to Bioparque Moncora or Syntropic Agriculture, or it could go to other things as we increase our governing capacities for allocating resources. So that is community fund number 2. Community fund number 3 is focused on regenerative education and entrepreneurship. Here, again, it's a very small budget, 4% of the total. Most of this money is going to the Origen del Agua Nature Reserve, which is actually an ecosystem restoration project, but they do a lot of community education work, teaching children how to turn a desert into a forest and how to restore watersheds. They have lots of community education programs. I just shared a great video into the design school a couple of days ago about Origen del Agua that you can go and watch. It's in the Bioregional Learning Exchange. And so some funding is going to Origen del Agua to their regenerative education work. And then some money is going into the same kind of seed funding for emergent projects. But I want to note that I am building the Barichara Regenerative Education Fund with external money at the moment. And there is a lot happening outside the budget of the Territorial Foundation. I want to stress that the money that I personally am bringing into the territory for regenerative education is actually larger than the entire budget we're talking about today. We're bringing in more than $225,000 in the next year into our regenerative learning ecosystem. So I want to emphasize that this is where the focus of the Territorial Foundation is to not compete with what is happening outside of it. And it is seeding some funding into regenerative education coherently with its other community funds. But one of its community funds that is emerging is the Regenerative Education Fund. But so far, all of that money is arriving through other pathways, and very little of it is coming through our Territorial Foundation. And that's just by the sort of history of how that money has emerged and how we're integrating these different processes. So our regenerative education budget is actually one of the largest budgets in our territory, but it's not visible in the budget I'm talking about today. And so I just wanted to stress that before we move on. Community fund number 4 is about cultural regeneration and territorial healing. Here we're allocating about 7% of the budget, and you'll see that our focus is on building a cultural capacity for regeneration in the territory. How are we doing that? One thing that we've observed is that there are a lot of people that come into personal or small family or community crisis, and there isn't a mechanism for them to get short-term financial support. So we decided to set aside a small amount of money. This is an experiment. It's an experiment in creating a rotating fund for community resilience. What do we mean by this? Is that we're taking a small amount of money from our budget, putting it into our community fund for resilience, and then anyone who has a financial need because of an emergency that is related to the purpose of this fund can request funding with a short-term, low-interest loan where basically, let's say like we have an example. There was a woman who was working at Origen del Agua, and so she was doing community education and ecosystem restoration work. She got hit by a motorcycle, was almost killed, and was hospitalized. Her family needed some financial support for medical bills while she spent 2 months in the ICU. Well, because we didn't have this fund, we didn't have an obvious way to support her family. But now we do. We can actually support her family to be able to pay their medical bills while she heals. And then the work that she does after she's gotten better, which is service work in the community, can look for ways to bring that money back into this rotating fund. So it could be that money that would be paying for her time for Oriental Agua, some of it could go here. We basically want to encourage people to create financial resilience through community relationships and not depend on outside money. Now, we don't know if this experiment's going to work. There are some interesting challenges and weakness to it, but we're going to put a little bit of money in and learn by practicing with the pool of money that's there to see if we can create a mutual aid network without needing external funding, where basically someone borrows money from the pool, but then others put money back into the pool to continually replenish it so that we can have money available for others who need it in the future. But then we also want to invest some money in creating a regeneration festival. Excuse me, I'm about to sneeze. Okay, the sneeze went away. We want to invest money in a huge celebration in the community where people come together and we showcase all the regenerative work in the territory. We have music and dance and singing, and we highlight all the projects, and we invite people from the community to be able to have this fusion of social identity, this celebration of the work, and elevate what everyone's doing. So we want to start to have an annual Regeneration Festival. So we're setting aside some funding for that work. And then again, we have a seed funding for emergent projects so that we can pool some money into things as they emerge, as we discover what's needed. This adaptive emergent way of financing is in every one of our funding mechanisms. The idea here is we want to cultivate the human relationships and the mutual aid to have more community resilience. And we want to increase the capacity to celebrate and come together and learn about what is happening in the community through this fund on cultural regeneration. Then community fund number 5, which is a really big one, is about our knowledge commons and bioregional learning. This is actually the largest part of our budget. 32% of the budget is going to our bioregional learning ecosystem. Now, how does this one work? We're in the process of creating something that we're informally calling the Geo Portal for Barichara. And the Geo Portal is a major piece of infrastructure that's already got some funding from last year and is in process, and we're going to allocate funding to continue. What does this Geo Portal do? First thing is that it does geospatial maps. We're partnering with Esri Colombia. For those who don't know, Esri is the international company that manages ArcGIS, and their global headquarters is in Bogota. And so they do fantastic work, and we're partnering with them to create geospatial maps of ecological and cultural information and integrating it with interactive websites. So we're going to build an interactive website where local people who control and manage their own data can create data about contamination sources for water, about changes in ground cover for vegetation with deforestation, and other kinds of information that are relevant to them to inform their work collectively with reliable and factually based information. So there's a big focus on geospatial mapping. There's a big focus on mapping the regenerative initiatives and how they relate to each other, both socially and geospatially. Who is collaborating around creating an ecological corridor? Who is collaborating around regenerative education? Who is collaborating around youth empowerment and other such regenerative initiatives? So a big part of this is both ecological and cultural organizing, communications infrastructure, and sharing, which means that we gather a lot of learning resources as open access materials on the GeoPortal, or we leverage some of the funding we're building here to fund the creation of some of those learning resources. And then there's the storytelling by the community. If you wanted to think of it as this is like the community media center, the community newspaper, the community blog, where we invite people to discuss and debate about a controversy that's happening in the community around water, around all the hotels that are coming in, about the fact there's not enough water for the campesino families, or whatever it may be. We want to create a transparent and open platform for community dialogue that is leveraging and that is leveraged by the data gathering and the learning resources that we gather. So all of this is connected with this GeoPortal for Barichara. In parallel with this, we want to focus on 3 key areas of capacity building. One of them is a project that I started prototyping with separate money It's called Historias Regenerativas, or Regenerative Histories. What we're doing with Historias Regenerativas is we have a media and communications team that is gathering and telling stories about things like the green belt of Barichara, or the history of our bioparque, or what's happening with regenerative education. So we basically have a media crew, a film crew, that is telling these stories. And we're building the capacity for data gathering and data analysis with the geospatial mapping, the regenerative initiatives, and the learning resources to do citizen science. So for example, we're creating education programs with local high schools for young people to go out and gather data. That data gets entered through our interactive web platform into the geospatial maps and becomes a citizen science framework for gathering data for community management of our resources. And then we're investing in an audiovisual center, which includes training people in storytelling, buying external hard drives, buying like iPhones that local people could use to gather stories and put them on Instagram. Basically, we're going to be building an audiovisual center, a communications and media platform, and a citizen science, data science framework, all of which is interwoven with the geoportal for Barichara. And so we're building a knowledge commons for bioregional regeneration. Now, Community Fund 6, the last of our community funds, is about regenerative economy and finance. Obviously, everything else is about regenerative economy and finance as well. Here, we're allocating 10% of the budget. And what we're doing is prototyping new economic models. For example, this year, in a local space called Casa Común, we're prototyping a regenerative entrepreneurship program for campesino youth. And we want to create different kinds of economic models for time banking, for community currencies, for all kinds of things. And so we're allocating some funding to continue that prototyping work because it's already been happening in the community. And we want to create strategies for mobilizing resources. There's an element of this that's about cryptocurrency and eco credits and some of those things that are happening in the Web3 space. Some of it is about creating different kinds of learning exchanges between bioregions to mobilize resources that support local education work, and so on. Basically, we need to allocate some funding to experimenting with finance models so that we can mobilize resources within the community and not depend on external funding. So we're allocating some of our funding to that learning work. And then we want to experiment with community financing tools, things like time banking and community currencies and so on, like what I had mentioned. And what you can see here is that this is emphasized in our story as we're going to set aside some resources to experiment and learn with different strategies because we don't know what's going to work, to adapt what we're doing based on what we learn through community development. And we're again going to have seed funding for emergent projects in this space. So in summary, you can see that with our budget of $225,000, about 25% of it is going to our core team. About 15% of it is to this multi-stakeholder convening and facilitation and leadership training, 6% to ecosystem restoration, 4% to regenerative education. Obviously, these are somewhat artificial boundaries because the actual work in the community is interwoven between them. Some work on regenerative culture, a big focus on our knowledge commons and learning ecosystem, and a little bit of funding for pathways to financial sustainability and sovereignty of our territory. And so you can see that this is a pretty powerful way of creating a budget for bioregional regeneration. So we're investing these modest resources in deep patterns of bioregional regeneration in very sophisticated and very advanced ways. And we're learning continuously as we go. But I hope that just seeing this example gives you some insights into the maturity of what we're doing, how advanced it has become, and also how to build these capacities in your own bioregion for the work that you're doing. So that's why understanding the thinking behind the budget, that we're taking collapse acceptance into it, that we're working on local autonomy, we're investing heavily in territorial governance, that we're building knowledge, communications, learning ecosystems, and then it's all interwoven at the territorial scale. And so, this is sort of like the golden Cadillac version, you might say. This is pretty sophisticated and pretty advanced work. But you can see that everything we're doing here is relevant to every other territory on Earth. They all need to create their own versions of this. And so what I'd love to do is invite questions and comments. We have plenty of time. I see Sanjay's really excited both at the beginning and the end. So Brando, come on in, Sanjay. What do you want to share?
Yeah, two questions. The term territory itself, how did that come about? I might have missed it in one of the prior sessions. And second is, you made the assumption, you said early on the assumption that, hey, you're not going to get more funding come 2 years from now, right? So is there, quote unquote, something like a rainy day fund that has been set up, or a mechanism to continue the work beyond the 2 years? Those are my critical questions at
So
this
I'd
point.
start by saying the way we defined our territory, which was about 4 years ago when we started on the path of creating a territorial foundation, we defined the scope of our territory in 3 stages, where the first stage was our small town and the nearby small towns and the watersheds around them, basically 10 kilometers away from us with the neighboring towns. So we could prototype in stream beds and small ecological corridors and so on. Then our second scale is we have 3 major watersheds. They're called the Suarez River, the Chicamocha River, and the Fonse River. And these are big watersheds. They're at the sort of middle of the northern Andes scale. Like Rio Suarez is over close to Bogota and comes down to us. The Chicamocha River starts very close to the boundary of Venezuela. So these are big watershed systems where we're prototyping with small scale to grow toward the scale of these 3 watersheds. And then our third scale is with the 3 mountain ranges of the northern Andes, which we're right in the middle of them. There's this network of canyons that those 3 watersheds are a part of, and the boundaries of those mountain ranges define a well-defined and fairly enclosed regional climate system. And we're trying to regenerate at the scale of that regional climate system. So our territory is defined with those 3 levels of action on different timeframes. First, 10 years or so, the local, out from there for maybe 10 or 20 years, the larger watershed, 30 to 50 years and beyond, the regional climate system. So that's how we define the territory. And then the answer to the rainy day fund, our way of thinking about the rainy day fund is to decolonize money, which is to say our rainy day fund is if we have no money, we have a huge amount of social capital and highly capable people. So if they're in healthy relationships with each other, and this actually happened with COVID in 2020, which is our local tourism economy just shut off from one day to the next. 90% of the money in the territory disappeared. And local trust networks started engaging in mutual exchange. And there are a lot of highly skilled people, stone workers, farmers, textile workers, et cetera. And they engaged in mutual aid exchanges without money. So our real rainy day fund is investing in human culture and knowledge, capacity, knowing each other, trust, and that's more valuable than money anyway. But of course, if money comes, we'll leverage all those capacities to do more. So that's, this is Latin America. They're used to corrupt people not ever getting money to them. So, our local mayor's office typically is mafia. We happen to have a good mayor at the moment. But so this way of working is really in that spirit, which is why I think we can get pretty far in 2 years because we're not starting from nothing. But yeah, great question. Now, Jennifer, over to you.
Yes, thank you. I want to ask because I'm working with a group of social facilitators. So I was very excited when you talk about it because we use art of hosting and agile model tools and another social technologies. And we are in Bacalar, Mexico, where is a beautiful lagoon with special microorganisms. And we're trying to do the very similar model as you present, like very similar. So I had a few obstáculos. I don't know how to say in English,
Obstacles, sí.
Obstacles, yes, because with the participation of people, because we made big calls of different ambientalistas, personas ambientalistas, and and not work always, because not everyone can come, because a lot of people that work in ambientalism didn't continue with the work because they have
¿Puedes
to.
decirlo en español? Yo puedo
Sí,
traducir.
puedo decirlo en español. Ah, gracias. Ok, entonces, muchas personas que trabajan para la laguna dejan de hacer su trabajo ambientalista porque tienen que trabajar por dinero. Entonces, entiendo mucho como todo el mindset del que hablas, como de la confianza y hacer red y todo lo entiendo, y es lo que hemos estado trabajando desde el aspecto social, pero justo estoy aquí como tratando de averiguar cuál sería el modelo o la forma de hacer ese fondo, porque siento que ese sería como la gravedad que uniría y que haría la identidad de la red, ¿no? De ambientalistas que protegen a la laguna de Bacalash.
Bueno, esa es una buena pregunta. Está bien si lo contesto en inglés. ¿Sí?
Sí.
Bueno, okay, so quickly to translate what Jennifer is saying. They have a lot of environmental leaders in their community, but as is so common, they end up having to stop that work because they have to make money. So they go work somewhere else. And so they have the challenge that they've put out a call to train people and work with them, and it's really hard to get participation. So the question is, how do you take this kind of a model and activate it and get it started and get the kind of participation you need? And so this is a very familiar problem for all of us. And I would say that what we did in Barichara, which is a strategy you might try, is that we gathered together a group of regenerative leaders who already had a track record of success. They'd already been doing things really well. And then with those people, we supported them to collaborate. And then they have other relationships. And so other people started to come through those relationships. And then eventually we ended up building these much larger networks of action. And so it might be that you offer trainings or just offer to facilitate in partnership with a small group of leaders. And then with them, start to make it more visible what is valuable, what you're doing, so that others would see, oh, we would like to know how to do that. And so, like in our case, it's really been a big change in Barichara when we had the change of the alcalde, change of the mayor. Because when that happened, for the first time in the history of Barichara, civil society groups could influence local policy. That never happened before. And before it was just like local mafia. It's like the mayor and their buddies would do whatever they wanted to do. So to actually have something like the Meseta de Agua, this civil society group, is new. That means there are people who are trying to facilitate processes, and they're discovering that there aren't enough of them that know how to do it. So they see the need. So I think there's something about sort of very selective organizing with a group of leaders that you know that you can help and that will value what you're doing, that will then make visible what that process did for other people to see. And then build it in that way. And because each of those leaders is working in different projects, it's actually a mycelial kind of an approach. The strategy does scale quickly, but it scales out instead of up. And so I don't know if that's helpful in your case, but that's what we did. And it was maybe the first 2 years of work was with a fairly small group of people and projects, going deep and building good relationships, but also building structures for participation that later could invite more people. So that now we have an audience that would want to learn art of hosting or sociocracy. Like we trained our own team in the Territorial Foundation. We trained them in value flows, sociocracy, holacracy, art of hosting. And they were very excited because we were struggling to work together. So the need was right there. So I don't know. Espero que eso te ayuda. No sé. Un poquito posible.
A ver, voy a intentarlo. Sí, gracias.
Bueno, no, gracias, Jennifer. Y Carlos, tu turno, siga.
Gracias, Joe. This is very much in line with Jennifer's question, or I hope it adds to that part of the conversation. And I'm thinking about the difference between distribution and organizing a budget, which you've laid out really nicely. And I have two questions, and feel free to just respond to one or in whichever one feels most alive. But then there's the upstream how do we even get a budget, which is, I think, part of what Jennifer is going at. And given the difference in legal structure and kind of bending ourselves to what the current financing models require, right? Whether it's limits, having a legal entity and processes and the due diligence checklist that foundations and other aid organizations have. A lot of times what you're talking about, it doesn't seem to fit any of that, right? So I'm just kind of curious how you package that pitch and kind of how if you could speak to the getting funds piece. And then on the distribution side, I don't know if you're able to share an actual example of who brought up a potential project or a potential distribution of, hey, I need $200 to get all the seeds for this part of that, or whatever it may be, education or whatever else. Just kind of curious how those inquiries flow up to decide on distributed funding. So those two pieces.
So I'll start by saying that the money that came to Barichara has still been almost 100% of the money that's come has been money that I've been able to bring through my global networks and everything else. And so that's unusual, right? Not everyone has someone that does that. So you can't do exactly the same thing. But the insight that I want to share is that for the first 3 years, I was trying to get anyone in Colombia to give me a bank account that I could put the money in so that it didn't have to come from my own personal money. And like I would get money from Gitcoin. I'd go participate in a Gitcoin round. I'd get some money. I'd bring it, and it would have to stay in my personal bank account with tax risks in the United States. And then I would, like a mafia guy in Colombia, I would withdraw it as cash, take piles of cash, and give it to people because no one would accept the money to their bank accounts, and there wasn't a nonprofit with a bank account to give it to. And so the truth was, and still is, that a lot of the money has happened informally outside of institutions. And that's a really important thing to know, because what happens outside of an institution is that you can do things that are small and agile and very creative. Like something that I did 3 years ago was I went on Twitter, asked if anyone would donate $2,000 to support a regenerative educator. Someone did, gave me $2,000.
Wow.
And that was enough money to fund a person in Barichara for 3 months full time at that time. So I just converted that money into Colombian pesos, withdrew it from the ATM machine, and gave cash to someone for 3 months. And during that 3 months, they piloted an education program.
I mean, you're really wearing your scientist robe and just like really going out and see what comes in.
And so, I give that example because later, when I tried to bring money to like the Territorial Foundation, I want to give money to our nonprofit. But wait, if I bring money to the nonprofit, there are people who suspect me of bringing money for my personal agenda. They're all worried about neocolonialism for very good reason, as you know. They have good reason to be concerned. Well, Joe brought money. Why does it go to the school his daughter goes to? How did he make that decision? So we actually learned that there are decisions I need to make about money that are kept separate from the foundation that I helped to create. Because those power dynamics are really important. They're really, really important. So when we bring money to the Territorial Foundation, that's why I said Natalia created this budget. She worked with everyone else. I did not create this budget. It is very clear Joe Brewer did not create this budget, even though I connected the funder, the foundation that brought all this money. And that's separating out the power and the decision-making, which is really important for cultural healing, for trust building, and for growing to a larger scale. But one specific example was during a Gitcoin round in 2022, I was able to raise a lot of money. We were the top recipient in the climate coordination round. We received $24,000. So what I did was I gathered 6 different regenerative projects. We sat in a room together for 5 hours, and I facilitated a conversation. And the conversation went like this. Everyone Please share what is happening with your project, but think about it as regenerative processes. What are the processes in the territory that your project is carrying forward? What are the capacities that are enabled by your project so that we can see systemically what are the processes being held across all of our projects by the 6 projects in the room. And we like sat, in chairs and sofas in someone's living room. It was this informal conversation. And each person said, this is what we're doing. These are the challenges. This is what we're trying to accomplish. And then at the end, I said, tell everyone here, how much money do you need? And each person said, we need this much money to pay Don Jesus, who prunes the trees, or this or that. And then at the end, I said, okay, now that we've heard what everyone's doing and what everyone needs, how do we distribute this money? This is how much money we have. And some of the projects got exactly what they asked for. Some projects got less than what they asked for because they said, we don't actually need this much and that project needs more. And they collaboratively allocated the money. And at the end of the meeting, we knew how much money to give all 6 of the projects. So you can see the co-creation and the collective intelligence, the trust building. And this is a true regenerative economy model, right? And so that's the learning that we're putting into our ciclos vivos now. Okay, how do you do that with 29 regenerative projects and not 6, where you don't have direct relationships with all of them? Well, then you need to have facilitation over the span of a year. You need to, there's more structure. But that's also the direction we're going, is we want the majority of money to be allocated by the projects themselves.
Thank you, Joe.
Yeah.
That's very helpful.
Much more to be said. There's a lot to that, but I hope that's a good starting point. And yeah, getting the money to come is mostly by being in right relationship with others. Like I've been able to help bring money to other territories in Colombia, where they've been able to learn from what we're doing and then build their own networks locally, where they did their own thing that, they did some like giving circle or something, and then we learn from them. So the learning with each other is really a big deal for this. It really is a big deal. Okay, Hunter, over to you.
I feel like maybe Jennifer and Carlos kind of were talking on the same thing. So maybe I've just am at this point of a comment, but the challenges I've faced here locally of different threads in my community that have like various levels of establishment in terms of capacity building, their ability to manage, especially in the system that we're in, which I think is very different than the system that you're currently in, although you probably know a lot about it. Money doesn't go as far, is a constant reality that we face here. The types of structures that we have often have a lot more, or at least my perception is that there's a lot more like invasion into our spaces of organizing by government interests who, at least the local government, seems to be really well intended, but often misplaced in terms of what they view as like the ultimate goal, because this idea of regeneration and actually understanding collapse is completely separate from how it is that they're approaching. And so I guess part of what I'm saying is simply that it's frustrating, which, I hate to just be like, let's commiserate together. That's not what I want to do. But I think I want to share that just to, it's really inspiring to see these systems and to be involved with versions of it locally to really bypass these old funding models and the need for these new opportunities and building them. I guess maybe if I could think of one thing, like when you're approaching, because you specifically talked about these existing programs that have these, we funded them early and now they've created their own financing models. Or do you view some of these as like more so cash cows where like there's an expectation we put in like a large sum of money. Now we actually have some form of contract or just generalized expectation that is properly being met through relationship of money now coming from that investment and being put into other things that are not in the control of the people who in some ways generated that money, but in many ways only did it because of the greater facilitation that got it there. How are you navigating those relationships and spaces? Is there any insight you can provide? Because I'm thinking that is meeting that is coming to a head right now for me in the question of building housing structures, where it's a huge capital investment. And because of the horrible system that we live in, it is a great way to make money and bring it in. We're trying to step away from that, but we're also recognizing that if the upfront costs are paid, that just means it's a source of cash flow. How do we create and establish and nurture the right relationships? So if you have any examples of that, it would be really enlightening. Thank you.
Yeah, I would say, yeah, I am commiserating with you because it's miserable. One of the things is to really recognize that multi-capitalism is true, which is to say there are different ways of storing and holding value. And when we really understand that, it's like, well, you might have an investment in land, but it may not generate money. It may just generate no-cost housing. It may generate another asset class, another way of measuring and storing value, but it's not money. It's actually the absence of need for money. You can give someone a lower salary because they don't have to pay rent because you gave them housing as part of the agreement. So you can start to think of these different kinds of value in creative ways. So that's just one element. I know you know that. I just want to name that again because it's a lot of playing and creativity is playing with different kinds of capital. Then the other is to recognize what right relationship means relative to purpose. Because it's not right relationship in some generic way. It's right relationship relative to purpose. So I'm going to give the example of the World School program that we're starting in our Regenerative School for Kids. In 2 weeks, we're piloting our first World School program. So in World School, families that are nomadic, that homeschool, usually wealthier, can afford to pay more money than local people, but their kids don't get enough social interaction. So they need to be able to go to alternative schools and put their kids in that school for a little while. So World School is that. It's basically like woofing for families with small kids. And so it's really awesome. It's all over the world. And there are not visible World School opportunities in Colombia. And Barichara is a major tourist attractor. So we're like, wait, what the hell? There's a business here. Right? There's a business. You could advertise World School and families would come and pay what is a reasonable amount of money in the US or Canada or Europe. That would be a lot more money than locals would ever be able to pay. So our World School program, this is about right relationship, right? We have 3 levels of cost. 2-week program, local people in Barichara pay the lowest cost because we really want to subsidize it for local people. But if we make it free, they won't value it. So we can't make it 0. We make it 100,000 pesos a month or 100,000 pesos a week, which is like, 25 US dollars. Local people can pay that. And we have a little clause. If they can't pay it, they can do some kind of an exchange. They could come in, they could bring food, they could do some repairs, they could volunteer part of the time. So a local person can actually come without paying money. They still have to give something, but the cost is low enough that everyone can probably afford it. Then any Colombian who doesn't live basically from San Gil and further is our little anchor. That nearby city, any other Colombian pays double that. They pay 200,000 a week. And again, they could ask for an exchange if they needed it, but that's a very reasonable cost for a Colombian. Someone from Bogota could afford 200,000 pesos for a week-long program while their kids are out of school because we scheduled it during the vacation. But a foreigner pays $400 for 2 weeks. So they're paying like 8 times as much. But $200 a week for an immersive outdoor education program for someone in the US is less than they pay in the US. So what that does is that allows us to have money from the outside arrive, goes into our education fund to support our teachers, but it's in healthy relationship to this sort of subsidiarity of cost. That the more local people are, they pay less because we're investing in them. And those from the outside pay more because they're actually receiving this huge, rich cultural immersion of Barichara, which we're structuring for them. And so at each level, this is the experiment, do people feel it's fair? Do they feel like they're getting enough value? And we actually think the World Schoolers from the outside, they might even donate money afterwards. They might be like, $400 to this was amazing. I could give another $200 into your education fund. I'll donate with PayPal. And so we're creating relationships that have reciprocity built in. That could actually be a cash cow of a sort, because if those are really successful, they could fund our teachers to give free education programs to community schools. But we're paying local people's jobs to work with local schools, and there's no extraction. The money that comes stays in the community because of the way we structured it. So you can see there are lots of elements to this, but that's just a concrete example of something we're trying right now How do we pay for our teachers to do community education with outside money? Is World School. We're going to try and do World School every 3 months, so 4 times a year. And if it gets to where it generates $3,000 or $4,000 each time, that'll pay like 2 full-time teachers for the year. And then they can do community education the rest of the time. So I think there's a lot of creativity like this. It's just being a good social entrepreneur and thinking of the investment in assets. Our most important investment in assets right now is investing in our teachers. Our teachers are so valuable that if we can keep them funded, they can give free education to our community. And so they're like the equivalent of an expensive buying of land is how do you pay a good salary to a teacher? And so we're dealing with that on a micro scale. So I hope that gives a little more insight. Of course, there's a lot more examples we could give, but right relationship is relative to purpose and context. Here we want money to come from the outside in a way that the money stays in the community, it's not extractive, and that it subsidizes. Basically, we're creating value in the community with outside money and with local money. And if the outsiders stop coming, World War III happens, people can't travel, the global economy collapses, we have local teachers, local relationships, and we can do it with just local relationships. We just don't do the World School program anymore. And so, we might just do something within Colombia where we have enough people from Bogota coming, we've built enough of a following that we can fund our teachers just with people in Colombia at that lower rate. Because that's just a scaling issue, right? You have enough enrollments, you cover it. And the enrollments aren't that much. It's like you get 20 kids each time, you're covering it. We've designed the model to be able to work. So I think business model design is huge in this, as you know. But that's the kind of way of thinking: multi-capital, right relationship relative to purpose, and designed in context. And then from there, we could talk about 1,000 examples.
Thank you.
Yeah, you're very welcome. And then Claire, over to you.
Yeah, I was going to say, Jennifer Collis and Hunter were kind of asking very similar questions. So again, on the theme. So I switched a little bit to how do you inoculate against like the colonized mindset? I think one of the things that we run into here is just people getting locked into old patterns of thinking and also not dreaming big enough to what is actually needed for regeneration because it's just so far out of, what is being thought about. So yeah, I would love you to speak to that.
Ooh, such a juicy question. This is a great question. And I just want to say that pretty much all of us, including most indigenous people on Earth, have been colonized. It's like within rounding error, 100% of humanity has been colonized. It's sort of true. There are exceptions, thank goodness, but very few exceptions. And so what I found is that the path of decolonization is this gentle, tender, intimate thing. It's very, very personal. And what I found to be the most powerful way to start bringing a decolonial process into being is to not advertise that we have money, first of all. Because if we're like, who wants money? Everyone's going to come asking for money. And, I just look like a bag of gold. I am literally the story of El Dorado that the conquistadors had. That's what campesinos think I am in Colombia. They think I'm a pile of gold, with gold being money, rather than gold being the spiritual energy of the sun bringing life to the earth, which is what the indigenous people thought, and still think. And so you don't attract people based on money. What do you attract them based on? Alignment of their personal passion. What's in their heart that they really care about, that brings them alive, that enlivens them. So that example that I was given with Carlos of the woman that I got $2,000 from Twitter and paid her for 3 months to do work, that was Milena. Milena is now on our team at Sueños del Bosque. We're funding her to do other work 3 years later. She's amazing. And in her case, I just asked her, Milena, what do you want to do? Well, first of all, how could I ask her? She already knew me. How did she know me? She had been hearing that I was helping to create regenerative education in ways that she felt alignment with. And she was like, is this guy for real or is he a neocolonizer? Oh, he seems to be kind of for real. Oh, when I talk to him, my sniff test tells me that he's not full of shit. Like there was all of that. She's a Colombian woman. She's not stupid. So she's feeling into all of that as she's meeting me. But then there comes a point where I sit down with her in the Bioparque in the little forest I'm growing, and I tell her about the forest I'm growing and all of that. And I said, so what is in your heart to do? What are you really passionate about? And what do you need financially to do it for a short period of time? Now, if we committed for a long term, you would start to feel like I'm your boss. We don't want to establish that power dynamic. So what does a short term mean? She told me her passion is to work on the social and emotional development of kids and cultivate a sense of the sacred and connecting them with nature. And I'm like, hell yeah, that's worth funding. If I had money, I would give money to that. And I said, how much money do you need? At the time, she said 3 million pesos, which in today's world is around 700 US dollars a month, just to give you a sense of it, which is a decent salary. It's not great, but it's decent. It would pay all of her bills. And I said, third, how long do you want it for? And she's like, I think about 3 months because I want to try this out. I'm not sure if I really want to do this or not. And she created an after-school program called Florecemos, or We Flourish. It was amazing because she's an incredible teacher, incredible pedagogy designer and all of that. And after 3 months, it was good. She could have run a business with it, but she decided to go to Spain and do a master's in cognitive neuroscience of emotional development and pedagogy because she's that kind of a brilliant person. So she went away. I didn't invest in her and she stayed. I invested in her and she left. But then she came back later because she's from Santander. She's from this region. And so she rejoined us later. So this example, how is this decolonizing? I did not go looking for her. I did not advertise money for a job. She heard I was doing something that aligned with her interests. She tentatively felt out if she could trust me. We together created a context of conversation, of intimacy and openness, where she could tell me what her passion is. All of that is decolonizing. And then she trusted me enough to tell me how much money she needed. At that moment, I did not yet have the money. Later that day, I went on Twitter and said, does anyone have $2,000 to support a regenerative educator in Barichara? And Brian and Susan of the GTV are the ones who brought that money out of their grant. That's how we started our working relationship. And so they took an Ontario provincial grant, justified funding us for people in the Toronto area to learn from us, which is also decolonizing Canadian money. Like there are layers and layers to the decolonizing, but it's that intimacy and that relationality that's so core, so fundamental in all of this. So there's much more to be said, but you can really see that it's really deeply about alignment of life energy between human beings. And then from there, all kinds of subtlety. Yeah.
That was a beautiful example. Thank you.
Yeah, and to be continued, of course. Thank you, Claire. And Kelsey, how's it going from another part of Colombia to here?
Hello. Actually, I have Luna here with us, and it's our first time here, and we'll just be the first one. She's going to be joining as soon as we're done. So she has a question.
Yeah, hi everyone. Thank you so much. It was mind-blowing. Like all throughout the meeting, we were with bubbly minds. So thank you for this. I have thousands of questions, but I'm only going to ask 2 of them. The first one is very simple. What is the kind of structure? I think you mentioned it, but just to make sure, the kind of structure that you finance on the projects that are being run. It can be both associations, enterprises, or people, if I understand correctly. And my question was, when you mentioned, for instance, in the water project, that you were financing them until sometimes they became autonomous. And I wanted to know if you had example of how, after some point, like they became autonomous, what kind of economic model they create. And I had another question around like cultural healing, because I think that it's a region that was also, there had a lot of violence in there, and I was wondering how also that healing and peace process kind of weaves with the whole regenerating process. Voilà. Thank you very much.
Well, before I answer you, I'm just gonna get this link to a documentary that you're gonna love. Oh, I gotta go grab it. This is called La Paz Anónima, and it tells the story of how the peace was constructed in Barichara. And it's pretty amazing. So let me start with the first question. How is all of this structured? Well, you're in Colombia, so you understand that most things are not structured formally, right?
Exactly.
That's really important. And actually, a lot of people still use cash in Colombia because once DIAN, which is the tax agency, once they find out that money is entered into any of the banks, all of the money laundering laws and all that stuff can stop any kind of innovation from happening. So we've actually found that a lot of what we do is keep things outside of organizational frameworks, because that's where they actually work, and they don't work once you put them inside an organizational framework. There are exceptions to that, but like, for example, there's Casa Común, which Kelsey has been to. Casa Común has a network of 120 local producers that have this like innovation hub, transforming resources, marketing and branding and packaging, a local community store. They have a community currency. They're doing cryptocurrency, like they're doing all kinds of stuff, right? Casa Común is not legally constituted as an organization. It's the home of Margarita and Donnie. And Margarita has been working with the local Cámara de Comercio, the local Chamber of Commerce, to see if they can create a new legal framework that doesn't exist, because their house is residential, but they're operating commercially, and the mayor's office could come and just hit them with taxes that would destroy the way that their economy functions. Because if they had to have a profit and pay taxes, then their regenerative economy would break. They have this mutual aid economy that barely makes enough money to support itself. And if they had to pay any operational costs, it would die. It's very, very fragile. And so she's just Margarita's a very clever entrepreneurial type of person that she's like, I'm just going to go talk to Cámara de Comercio and say, like, could we just create a new legal category for what we're doing? And of course, they don't know what the hell she's talking about. And it's a process, it takes time. But Casa Común is a really good example of something that became financially sustainable in a certain way, which is that they barely keep it going at all times. They always feel like it's about to close. They always feel like they're about to not have the money they need. But because they built such diverse networks of trust and so many different kinds of mutual exchange, they're continually reinventing themselves in ways that are actually sustainable. And I think the insight is to never think of Casa Común as a thing. Like it became the thing and the thing became sustainable. Instead, to do the indigenous perspective, right? It's a verb. It's a dynamic unfolding that is continually happening relationally. So it's continually adapting to changing environments. And that dynamic is sustainable, even though it never legally constituted. And that's a deep decolonizing, but I think it's a really important insight. So yeah. And then did I answer your questions well enough, or was there something else? I think I might have missed something there.
No, it's pretty good. Just maybe a quick detail about, I hate KPIs and everything, and I guess it's because you have like some very private donors that are cool with not having too strict maybe KPIs. How do you report if it's also like, dealing with between the structured and the unstructured, like you said, it must be interesting.
Yeah, so what I found is that a basic practice of flow funding is really important here, which is that in flow funding, which I've got a couple of the webinars I've given on this, and there's great materials. Go look at Regenerosity and Kinship Earth, and Kelsey knows some of the people. But the key inside of flow funding is it's trust-based. The local person is the expert. And there's a flow funder, which is someone who has money to give to someone else. And there's a flow fund recipient who has local expertise. So let's say you're the flow funder. Well, actually, Kelsey is a flow fund recipient. So I'll use Kelsey as an example. We have money from the design school that we have given to Kelsey. Other members of the design school, after learning what Kelsey does, have given money to Kelsey. Now, why is that? Because Kelsey's telling the story about what she's doing. So the reporting is in the storytelling. And because there are personal relationships. So I met Kelsey, I'm like, Kelsey's cool. All right, we can give a little bit of money from the design school to Kelsey. Kelsey was at our design immersion. Other people were at our design immersion. Some of those people were like, Kelsey's cool. I want to give Kelsey some money. And so the personal relationships are a really big deal. And the fact that I don't need to know what Kelsey's doing. I just need to know that I trust Kelsey when she tells me what she's doing. I'm not an expert in the Arhuacos or the Tyronas. Like, I'm in Santander. I'm not in Tierra, I'm not in Santa Marta. So I don't need to know that. I just need to know that she knows that. And so you see the reporting through storytelling is deeply relational and structured as narratives. And that covers most of it. What it doesn't cover is the other part, which is how you get to large scale. That works great if I'm giving $500 to Kelsey, but it doesn't work great if I'm giving $1 million. And so what's the difference?
That's my question.
Yeah, and the difference is that at that larger scale, you have to have some kind of collective intelligence. You have to have some way of having a holistic understanding, lots of information, lots of good data, measurement frameworks, tracking toward them, very complex management frameworks. Because at that scale, like, how could you even write contracts to give out $1 million? So just administering the funds requires systems. And so the difference is, how do you do that? And I think the philosophical point of view is you take what I just said for tiny amounts of money with flow funding and say, what is the spirit of that? How do you honor that in a larger system? Well, one thing is Kelsey being the one who knows her local context. How does that adapt itself to a larger system? We have a multi-stakeholder network that creates its own agenda, its own objectives, and its own tracking toward its goals. And then they gather their own data. Well, now the trusted individual, which was Kelsey before, is now a multi-stakeholder network with some kind of reporting protocol of the network to itself. The participants are tracking it together, but when you do that, you're doing reporting well enough to report to a funder. So you see, it's like that. And then you're able to build the systems in the same spirit of place-based, local expertise, flow funding, but you're flowing funding into increasingly well-structured management frameworks, but they're well-structured relative to their purpose. So from there, of course, that's why we have, the budget I shared was not a simple flow funding. It wasn't like Joe showed up with $10 and gave it to someone. No, we're $225,000 going to a network of projects with really clear processes, and 25% of it is monitoring, evaluations, reporting, and administration. Because we're building toward the capacity to receive the $1 million. Right? So, but we're doing it in this flow funding way. So that's the dance that you do, is you practice small, you practice in diverse ways, and then you build support structures that are fit to task. And they get bigger and more elaborate because you're getting bigger. Your work is maturing, so it's getting more complex, more diverse, more decentralized, more diversity of frameworks happening in parallel. All of that will just naturally happen in the success of what you're doing. Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
Amazing. Can I hop in with another question?
Of course. Yeah, and then we'll wrap up after this because we're at time. But yes, there's time for another question.
Okay, so as we are expanding in these projects and looking, okay, say we're building out this financial projection for a project we're trying to get funded. Our organization doesn't necessarily have the KPIs readily available, but if there's other organizations within the same bioregion who are also collaborating on the same projects, are we able to, I guess it's about relationship building with them, but like, where does the line be drawn? Like, are we able to use their KPIs because they're working with the same community? Like, what kind of relationship needs to be formed between the two separate entities that are working kind of for the same goal, but with separate missions, when there's not like that relationship built already? But then are we able to use some of the data that they've already collected for like, I don't know.
Yeah, to report.
Yeah, to report for the same community we're trying to get funding for.
Well, so there are two key things here. One is, like you said, you don't have the relationship in place. So building the relationships is a big part of this. And one of the things that has been a major source of conflict and tension in Barichara is the use of narratives and who represents whom in what way. Like, how can you represent the Arhuacos? You can see that's a very sensitive political issue. There are ways that are okay, there are ways that are not okay, there are ways you already have agreements, and ways that you aren't clear on what the agreements should be yet. And this is a big realm of the work of building relationships. And so we're now at the point of maturity where we're creating clear policies for representation and use of narrative. Whereas we've been practicing in different settings to learn what we need to know to build those policy frameworks, but it's because we've got several years of experience practicing it. So like, can you use someone else's data to support your story? Well, you can if it's public access data and it's related to the actions you're taking. Magdalene is asking in the chat, KPIs, key progress indicators. That's a terminology from management, from organizational management. So basically, there may be data that you can use because of the way the data is structured. It's publicly available data. Absolutely, you can use it. But can you leverage the success of their program for what you do? No, because they're the team that did it. And so you see that the representation of narratives is where you build trust and where you build clarity. And,
Okay.
and in that place, you'll discover things like, well, we can't say we're partnering with them if they don't know about us. You know, that's going to come back and bite us later. So you see the sensitivity is in being mindful and caring about the relationships. And that representation and use of narratives gives you a way of orienting. It's not the only way, but it is a very helpful way of orienting. Can I use this story? What does it represent? And is that in right relationship? And as you're asking that, you'll see that several of those questions your answer will be no, which means you have to build different relationships. Some of them will be yes, you're like, cool, I can do that. And then you can justify it because the logic of that argument is the logic, it was public access data about point sources of pollution, and that's what we're dealing with. You know, you're like, your argument is clear. So yeah, but I think there's...
That's like bioregional research, and we found the public data, and we're using that public data for...
Absolutely. And then the other thing, just as a quick comment, is through the Northern Andes Regeneration Fund, we're creating shared frameworks for all of the territories so that they will have shared reporting, shared progress indicators, shared thematic areas. It's like, for example, we have a thematic area for regenerative education in all the territories. We have a shared focus on hydrological cycles in all the territories. And that allows us to create shared frameworks across and within territories, and our budgeting, our monitoring, our evaluation will be similar enough that we can share stories. Mm-hmm. That's all by design, it's all intentional. So yeah, just to say there's a strategic way of going about it that is multi-scale, but that's another conversation. Yeah, awesome, good to see you. Hi Luna, nice to meet you.
Thank you, really nice to meet you guys too.
Cool, so I'm gonna go ahead and wrap us up because we're 5 minutes over and several people have already had to leave. But I just want to end by summarizing the main point of the session today, which is I wanted to show how you can be strategic in the way you structure the allocation of money that reveals a story about how to invest in the regeneration of an entire bioregion. Like, you can have a bioregional lens, you can work on regenerating the whole bioregion, and you can have coherent stories related to how you structure relationships and how you move resources. And that there are really powerful ways of doing it. It's very practical, and I hope you try this at home. Please try this at home. Try this in your own bioregion. And of course, come and learn with us in Barichara. Oh, Kelsey and Luna have their hands up again, but we're at time. Okay, is it something quick? Go and bring it in real quick, or no? So all good? Okay, just want to be mindful of everyone's time. Awesome, thank you everyone, to be continued, and have a beautiful weekend.
You as well, Joe.
All right, bye.
Bye, team.